So what I wanted to talk to you people about today is food security and nutrition in India, like was given in the topic. So in this 1 hour, I'll quickly try to lay out basically the broad issues related to food security and nutrition in India, and a little bit on the government's response to the issue of food insecurity and how we look at it. So since we have only 1 hour, it's a kind of a broad-based lecture trying to introduce the viewers to various issues in this area. And of course, later, if anybody is interested in pursuing any particular aspect, I would be happy to share readings or information. Why do we really need to even talk about food security? These are things that might be familiar to many of you, but basically, if you look at the consumption basket of poor and wage earners, food still constitutes 2/3 of the consumption basket in our country. So whatever little that people are earning, a major part of it is still spent on food. And that is on the side of the demand. Even if we look at food production, we see that although the share of the population which is working in agriculture, even in rural areas, is declining and declining quite sharply, as well as the share of agriculture in the GDP. There are still a large number of households which are working in agriculture, even if they are involved in multiple sources of employment. There is one foot in agriculture in most of the particularly rural households. So more than 50% of the population is still employed in agriculture, almost 50% now. But what is also important, one, that a lot of what people spend goes on food, that a lot of the people are involved in producing food, and even more importantly, that even during the period when India was growing at more than 8%, now the growth rate has of course slowed down, and I'm broadly talking about the pre-COVID period only. India is still home to the largest number of malnourished population, even more than sub-Saharan Africa. And this is not only, I'll show some data, this is not only in terms of absolute numbers, because India is a big country, but even when you look at the proportion of the population which are malnourished by various metrics, those ratios are much higher in India than would be predicted by our income levels or growth levels. And we continue to have periods and from certain pockets, reports of hunger and starvation that still come about. Of course, there is a lot of debate on defining starvation deaths at all in the first place. But without getting into it, just the reporting of deaths which are caused due to hunger or starvation, that itself is it indicates a broader problem. It's only a tip of the iceberg of what constitutes our food insecurity. So chronic malnutrition is severe, and this is something various people have been writing for a long time. And there have been some improvements in the recent period, but still the levels in India continue to be quite high. And this is reflected in various global comparisons. For instance, if we look at the Global Hunger Index, which comes out every year, and it does become front page news in our newspapers as well, you see that India is now in a category which is called serious, which is, and the index is between 20 and 34.9. But what is to be noticed here is the countries which are serious, this yellow, is within South Asia and a number of African countries. The only countries which are worse off in the alarming category are those countries which are also conflict ridden, have been facing famines and so on. And if we look at the state-wise details in India, you will see that a number of states are actually in the alarming category as well. If we look at another indicator, which is an indicator of stunting amongst children, stunting is an indicator which measures heights of children according to their age. And based on the WHO norms, it has been seen that up to the age of 5, if all the required inputs are given, then children across the world, WHO did a cross-country study which shows that children across the world have similar growth patterns, and they fit within this normal curve as far as their height for age goes. So if we compare to that reference population, you again find that a large proportion of children in India are stunted, which is basically they have a lower height for age than they should be having at their than the height that they should be having at their age if they had got all the nutritional and health inputs that they are supposed to be getting. So India has 38% of its children under 5 being stunted, and this again, like we can see in this map, is amongst the highest in the world. Stunting is a reflection of chronic undernutrition, so it is not something that happens over a few days or even a few months. It is not because of one episode of diarrhea or something like that, but it is something actually that reflects particularly amongst younger children, maternal undernutrition, intergenerational impacts of malnutrition, as well as current access to nutrition, health, and sanitation. So it is seen as being a very sensitive indicator of not just malnutrition amongst children, but also the level of development in an economy from the point of view of human development and quality of life for people. The problem is not only amongst children. We talk about children because childhood is the age group where is the period where often malnutrition sets in. But more importantly, childhood is also the period where you can actually address this problem. As you probably know, in the first 3 years, 90% of the brain growth happens in a human being's life. And during this period, if adequate nutrition is provided, then that sets the base for adult growth, both physical as well as mental. And on the other hand, it's also seen that when malnutrition sets in and interventions take place during childhood, then you can actually, there is a window of opportunity to reverse the impact of malnutrition, which becomes much more difficult in adulthood to actually reverse the impact of malnutrition. And there are a large number of studies again which show, there are longitudinal studies from various parts of the world which show the impact of childhood undernutrition on adult productivity, adult health outcomes, longevity, and so on. So if you look at adult malnutrition as well, based on the National Family Health Survey 2015-16, which is NFHS 4, in India, you see that over a quarter of adults are also in the category that is considered to be undernourished, which is having a low body mass index. And the body mass index is the ratio of weight to height. About a quarter of adults in India, both men and women, have a low BMI, and it's more prevalent amongst women compared to men. The other kind of contradiction that we see in India, one of course, is that the levels of undernutrition amongst children and adults, both acute and chronic, are much higher than what our incomes would predict it to be. What we are increasingly also facing is what is being called a double burden of malnutrition, which is that not only do we have undernutrition, but each round of survey is also showing that the proportion of population in the country which is overweight or obese is also increasing. So in the NFHS 4 data, over 20% of women and almost 20% of men in the country are seen to be overweight and obese. While this might seem a problem of the rich, we have to also understand, and I won't have time to talk about this very much today, but I did want to mention that there is this issue as well which needs to be considered, because obesity and overweight amongst adults is a predictor of a number of non-communicable diseases. And in health as well, we are seeing this double burden in India, where we continue to have communicable diseases like tuberculosis and malaria, which are diarrhea, pneumonia, which are causing death amongst children and adults. At the same time, an increasing burden of diabetes, hypertension, and so on, which are also caused by obesity and being overweight. The point is that, without going further into this double burden, is that there is obviously therefore a problem in food security, not just in narrow terms of being able to fill our stomachs, but in terms of the quality of food that people across the spectrum are able to eat. Of course, the burden is much more on the poor and those in the informal sector and marginalized groups and so on. Just one more point before I move on, actually from double burden, what we are discussing now is what is called triple burden of malnutrition, which is not just undernutrition and obesity, but also the third angle being a micronutrient malnutrition, which is that you might seem okay in terms of your height and weight, but for instance, the spread of anemia or vitamin D deficiency. So various deficiency of micronutrients is also something which is highly prevalent in India, and again something that can be quite directly related to the diets that people are consuming. And when we look at diets, even just in simple terms of calorie intake per day, I've just picked the graphic from a newspaper article in the Hindu, but there are a lot of academic articles which have discussed this whole calorie puzzle in India, which is that over the years, what we have been seeing is actually a declining average calorie consumption in India, whereas the norm is 2,400 kilocalories in rural areas and 2,100 calories in urban areas. What we are seeing is that on the one hand, while poverty ratios were reducing, per capita incomes were increasing, on the other hand, the average calorie consumption has also been reducing. We don't have data after 2011-12 because this data comes from the consumption expenditure survey of the NSS, for which we do not have any data after 2011-12. There was a consumption expenditure survey conducted in 2017-18, but the government has not accepted the report of that survey because they've said there were some issues with the quality of the data. It's not just in case of calories, but even if you look at it in terms of protein consumption, you find that there is a decline in per capita protein consumption over the years. Per capita fat intake, on the other hand, has increased a little bit, even more so in urban areas, and that possibly also holds a clue to the increasing overweight obesity problem that we are seeing. Like I said, what we take as being most sensitive, however, indicators, both in terms of understanding what is going on as well as for planning interventions, is what is happening among children, because much of the adult malnutrition cannot be reversed. So amongst children, the main source of data on malnutrition is from the National Family Health Survey. The last full survey data that we have is for 2015-16. NFHS 4, and before that in 2005-6 NFHS 3 was conducted. And based on the survey, we see that in this 10-year period between 2005-6 to 2015-16, there is indeed an improvement in the prevalence of undernutrition amongst children, especially when we look at these indicators of stunting and underweight. Stunting, like I said, is an indicator of chronic malnutrition. And now if you look at WHO, UNICEF, medical professionals, this is the indicator that they often use to see what is going on. And we saw almost a 10 percentage point reduction in stunting in this 10-year period, which is not very fast, but it is not slow either. It's quite, and especially comparing to the previous trends in India, which was between 1998 and 2005-6, where there was no reduction in stunting in the country. This 10-year period where there was a 10-point reduction is considered to be quite, it put India onto a positive trajectory, and there was a hope that this would continue further. Although now there are doubts on how much improvement we will see in this. I will show a little bit of data related to that also, because of the impact of the pandemic and various other things. Underweight is an indicator of weight for age, which is kind of, it's a composite indicator. It's difficult to interpret, but it is very commonly used because measuring weights of children is very easy. So if you look at our Anganwadi centers and so on, what they measure is underweight, and we saw a reduction in that as well. In wasting, there is no difference, but the way the nutritionists have interpreted this is to also say that while there is acute malnutrition, this could also be a reflection of children's heights increasing in this period, and therefore you did not see as much improvement in wasting. Anemia also still very high, but reduced by almost 9 percentage points. Of course, we still have to, and again, there is no time, but for anybody who wants to study particularly human development outcomes in India related to health and nutrition, the all India picture hides more than it tells us, because there is a huge variation amongst states when you look at the prevalence and the impact of undernutrition. So this is just one again map, just to give you an indicator of why looking at interstate difference is also very important. This is looking at the disability adjusted life years, which is attributable to malnutrition, which is that how many life years are lost because of malnutrition related, child malnutrition related issues. And there again, basically what we see is that much more amongst in this belt, which is the central and eastern Indian belt, which has the highest rates of malnutrition and also therefore the highest rates of infant and child mortality. The states in the west and southern India are relatively better, as well as in the top north. And again, this is not only related to levels of per capita income or poverty ratios, but has to do with many other factors as well. The current situation is something where we don't have much literature, but we do have a number of small field surveys and so on, which show that the post-COVID burden of hunger and malnutrition, like I said, it seems quite clear that there will be an increase in these indicators. And we have preliminary results from the National Family Health Service 5, which are not very encouraging. So the NFHS 5, which was conducted in 2019-20, I'm sorry there are so many figures and this is a bit of a crowded slide, but I'll quickly explain what it is saying. So the NFHS 5 was started in 2019, but they had to suspend the survey after its first phase in February 2020 because of the pandemic and the lockdown and so on. So in November 2020, they released the data from 22 states and union territories for which the survey had been completed. So this is pre-pandemic data, but it gives us some indicator of the direction in which malnutrition has been going in our country post 15-16, when we had NFHS 4. And this table and slide has been put together by IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute. So what the NFHS 5 data is showing is actually a little worrying in terms of the trends, because you see that stunting has actually increased in 13 out of the 22 countries for which we have the data. In 9 states, it has decreased, but even there, the decrease is not very high. For example, if you look at, say, Andhra Pradesh, where it's decreased, it's from 31.4 to 31.2, Assam 36.4 to 35.3, Kashmir also, like it's less than 1 percentage point in most of the states where it shows a decrease, except in Bihar and Sikkim, and we need to understand further what's happening in these different states. But the overall picture is not very encouraging. And going back to what I said earlier, stunting is an extremely sensitive indicator of not just what is happening to children under 5, but what is happening overall to the lives of people in terms of their quality of life. Because if you look at the determinants of stunting, they are multiple. There are lots of things that affect it, and you rarely ever see situations where stunting actually goes up. In extremely poor countries, in African countries where there's been war, there has been conflict, there's been famine, even in those contexts, there are very few examples of situations where stunting has gone up, and therefore this is a cause for concern. We will not be able to understand fully what this means and what are the factors responsible for this until we have the entire NFHS results. But of course, that would also be contaminated now by the pandemic, because the second phase of the survey of the remaining states and UTs had restarted in about June 2020, by which time we had already had the migrant crisis and further economic slowdown and so on. Even so, there have been some people writing, and there is some hypothesis at least, that between 15-16 and 19-20, what we have been seeing in terms of declining growth rates, stagnant real wages in rural areas, the impact of certain economic shocks like the demonetization and GST, as well as stagnant investments in direct nutrition programs such as the ICDS and midday meal schemes, that all of this could have contributed to the situation where we actually now again see ourselves moving away from the declining trend of stunting that we saw in the previous 10 years. And so, what are these different factors and what are those programs? Is what I would like to kind of focus on today. And the context for why I think this is very relevant, needs much more research and thinking and teaching to students as well, is because how prevalent the problem is, and also that it's not on its way out. Before I get into the factors, some quick, and I'll just run through these statistics. But to say that while there is such high prevalence of malnutrition, it's also very clear that it's very unequal in the way in which it is distributed. And all of these are from NFHS 4, 2015-16, because NFHS 5 data is still not fully out. So whether you look at it by income quintiles, you see that stunting prevalence is much more amongst the poorest than amongst the richest, although even amongst the richest there are children who are stunted. The same for adults. Even if you look at consumption of foods, you see that in the richer households, people are consuming foods more, foods of higher quality more frequently than in the poorer households. Like if you look at milk and fruits, milk and curd, in milk products, basically only less than half of those in the lowest quintiles said that they eat any milk products at least once a week, whereas 86% in the highest quintile said so. Similarly, in fruits, less than 20% to over almost 3/4 in the highest quintile. In the non-vegetarian foods, you see a less this kind of a trajectory, but this is also because of the effect of caste as well, that there are more upper castes among the higher quintiles who are probably vegetarian, and therefore what the effect you see is a mix of both of these. Even when you look at it by caste and tribe, by SC, ST, OBC kind of categories, you see that stunting and underweight prevalence or adult undernutrition prevalence is highest amongst the scheduled castes, and the scheduled tribes, followed by the OBCs, and then by others. By region, if you look at it as urban and rural as well, once again, much more prevalence in rural areas than in urban areas. And this also is something that many other indicators, economic as well as social, shows us. We see that in malnutrition as well. And interestingly, often there is a kind of a common sense view that certain things like say fruits and milk would be more available in rural areas because they're freely available, but you see that that's clearly not the case. Fruits especially is quite striking, where in urban areas 63% women consume fruits at least once a week, whereas in rural areas it's only 37%. What it also shows is that is the changing food systems, and how in rural areas as well people are basically dependent on the market to access their foods, especially everything other than cereals. There is also the state-wise difference, which I showed you in that map, which you can also see here. I've just compared Bihar and Kerala, the best and the worst amongst the big states. And you see that stunting, for instance, in the prevalence in Kerala is 20%, whereas the prevalence in Bihar is almost half. So by various metrics, there is also, when we are studying malnutrition or food security, the issue of the inequality, which also needs to be kept in mind. Inequality by class, inequality by caste, by region, by state, and by gender. You see an inequality both in the consumption as well as in the outcomes of malnutrition that we see. So in this context, why did I talk so much about malnutrition? Often one also thinks that when we are talking about food security, especially in the policy space, it's all about rice and wheat and production. But the definition of food security, which was agreed upon in the 1996 World Food Summit, which had all the countries across the world, is that food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. So it's not just about having some food, and it's not just about filling your stomach. It's not just about not starving. It's about having food which is nutritious, it's having food which is sufficient and which is safe, which is enough to meet dietary needs, and not just any food. It cannot be tablets or some ready to eat paste or powder which meets your nutritious food, but actually something that also meets the food preferences for an active and healthy life. So this three-line definition of food security is basically laying out all the various things that need to be in place for us to say that there is actually food security, that it has to be for all people, it has to be physical as well as economic access, that it has to be nutritious food, not just any food, food which is culturally acceptable, locally available, something that leads to an active and a healthy life. Now, from that point of view, the FAO, and this is again quite standard in most of the literature, we talk about four aspects, four dimensions of food insecurity or food security when we talk about it, that we have to look at these four aspects and what is happening to food in each of these to then determine whether food insecurity as defined here is being achieved or not. And this brings in a lot of things together, and this is also in the recent times what it's being called is the food system approach to nutrition, that nutrition and food systems have to be seen together. So it's not just about how much rice and wheat are we producing and how many people are malnourished, but it is this entire chain, right from production to storage, distribution, and then finally absorption. So the dimensions of food security are earlier they would be three. Now we talk about it in terms of four. The first three are availability, access, and utilization or absorption. Availability means how much production is there. It's not just about your domestic production, it's also about any trade that one is doing. So availability is what is available for consumption at any given period of time, which is food production plus net imports minus whatever is there in stocks and therefore not available for immediate consumption. Access, it's not just enough to have, and this is where the physical and the economic comes in. It's not just enough to have the outputs, it's not just enough to produce food, but are people actually being able to consume food? And when you look at food consumption, people, you can think about it as mainly three sources from which people consume food. The first is their own production. The second is from buying from a market. And the third is from government programs and social security and support kind of schemes. So if you look at that, therefore in access, issues such as purchasing power, access to markets, what are the prices, food inflation, these are the kind of issues that come in. The third is utilization or absorption, which is that you might have the food being produced, you might have the physical and economic access to the food, you might actually be eating the food, but your body is still not absorbing the nutrition. And this depends on a number of factors. It depends on diversity in diets. Like I've been saying, you might be eating, but you might be eating a heavily cereal based diet, which is not good enough, or you might be eating iron but not eating the vitamin C which is required to absorb the iron. So what is the quality of the diet and the diversity of the food that you're eating is important. Intra-household distribution, feeding practices, a big issue. I'll mention that a little later. And also, in fact, prevention of disease. So diseases such as malaria, diarrhea, these are things where you might be eating enough, or worms. So deworming, for instance, is a very important factor, because you might be consuming food, but it's because of infection that the nutrition is not being absorbed. And that is, of course, also a cycle, because your malnutrition increases your susceptibility to disease, makes your immunity weak, and disease also increases malnutrition. And the fourth factor, which was added later, the fourth dimension to food security, is stability or sustainability, which is basically looking at the environmental factors. So we have been seeing also in the recent periods over the last decade or so, not just in developing countries but across the world, a greater volatility in food prices, and this is closely also linked to volatility in food production, which is to do with factors related to climate change as well. So unseasonal rains, droughts, floods, etc., which are causing also a volatility in food production. So in the remaining part of the lecture, what I would like to do is look at each of these dimensions quickly in the context of India and where do we stand. If we so I mean, in terms of outputs, we looked at it that if you finally look at malnutrition or food security, there is a prevalence of food insecurity and malnutrition in the country, and that the improvements were okay and again seem to be stagnant now. Now what I'll try and do is to try and link these two. Then if these are the dimensions of food insecurity, can we look at what is going on in each of these and see where are the gaps? Why is it that we have such poor outcomes? So the first is availability. And if we look at availability broadly, what we can say is that as far as cereals are concerned, we are broadly at a level which is sufficient enough production to meet the needs of India, and but it has not been growing very spectacularly. So if you look at the per capita availability of food grains, the level at which we are now is something we had achieved, in fact, by the 1980s, but we had a period where it declined post the liberalization and economic reforms, and that has kind of increased a little bit again. But overall, there are issues in terms of agricultural productivity and so on. So one can't say that we are super comfortable. Productivity needs to increase because the population is still increasing. But at the same time, as far as cereals are concerned, one can say that there is some amount of self-sufficiency that has been achieved, and a lot of this, of course, also has to do with the green revolution. With pulses, it is actually not as good. Pulses also, the last few years, it has started improving. But if pulses are important because it is the main source of protein in Indian diets, also important because there are very few countries in the world that grow pulses. So it's not as if there is a bountiful amount available in the global market either. But India has been importing pulses the last few years, but those imports have been declining. There is some improvement. So overall, in terms of availability, there is we are okay, but it's not so much a cause of concern. It is from the point of view of agriculture and livelihoods and productivity and so on. But from the point of malnutrition, of the various dimensions, this is where we are relatively more comfortable, and therefore it also tells us that the issue is more in the distribution. And that's where the whole access related issues come up, which is that cereals still contribute to 60 to 70% of total calorie intake. So we have enough cereals, but we are also seeing that point that I was saying about the diversity, that most of the calorie intake is still made up of cereals across various deciles. So even amongst the richest decile in the population, you find that over 50% of the diet is made up of cereals. Amongst the poorest, that is over 70%. The other big factor is, of course, affordability. And on affordability, I am mainly summarizing the findings from a recent paper, which has just come out in the journal Food Policy, based on NSS data, which I think throws a lot of light on what we know from other kinds of smaller studies, but this is quite comprehensive. So the reference is there below in the slide. So in this paper, what they're basically doing is they're estimating the cost of a recommended diet. So they looked at what is the diet that is recommended by the ICMR, the Indian Council for Medical Research, and then they looked at the cheapest sources for each of the food groups and the quantities that ICMR recommends, and they came up with this cost. And the calorie recommendations are slightly lower for women, requirements are slightly lower for women than for men, and therefore you have these different prices for men and women. That 45 rupees for women and 51 rupees for men is what their estimated cost is, which is almost 1.6 times the commonly used World Bank poverty line. So the poverty line that is commonly used is higher I'm sorry, the amount of money that is required to buy food, which to meet your recommended dietary requirements, is more than even the poverty line income. So and further, in real times, they find that this cost of recommended diets actually increased by more than 3.5 times for men and women between this 10-year period between 2001 and 11. So this is a period, however, of rapid reduction in poverty and increase in wages, but food also became expensive. So while India achieved a rapid reduction in poverty in the 2000s, a majority of its rural population, the paper finds, was unable to afford nutritional diets, and nutritional poverty was significantly higher in India than what is captured by commonly used poverty measures. So the paper is estimated, like I said, the COD by looking at the cost of the cheapest food items in each of these groups across India's 380 rural districts, and the price also they got from the NSS data. So they calculated the price of the nutritionally adequate food basket and then checked its affordability. So if you look at these various other measures, if you look at rural poverty by World Bank or prevalence of undernourishment amongst adults based on FAO data and so on, they show much less food insecurity than if you go by this measure, which is the proportion of rural population which cannot afford the cost of recommended diet, which is 63.3%. And rural population unable to afford after accounting for non-food spending, that there are essential non-food spendings that people do. It's not as if you would spend your entire income on food alone. If that is taken into account, then the paper finds that over 3/4 of the rural population in India, based on their current earnings, actually cannot even afford the recommended diet. So from the point of view of access, in terms of economic access, this paper clearly throws light that if you look at diverse foods and a recommended diet, then most people in rural India actually still cannot even afford this. I'll just skip this in the interest of uh, time. So basically, in terms of affordability and access, there is also an issue. So availability, we said that it's not so much of an issue, but you need continuous intervention to ensure that there is no shortage. As far as cereals are concerned, but in terms of pulses, oil seeds, fruits, vegetables, there's a lot of interventions required in terms of availability as well. In terms of the second dimension, which is access, we find, and I could have given many more kinds of data, but I chose to restrict to this one paper. But overall, if you look at the level of wages and incomes in India, a vast majority of people cannot afford the cost of the recommended diet. And that again, even this paper, although it just came out recently, it's based on data only up to 2011-12. So once again, if we triangulate it with this fact that the 2019 NFHS 5 shows worse nutrition outcomes, as well as over a year of the pandemic, one can only understand that these access issues would have gotten exacerbated. And then finally, if you look at utilization, this is the area where there are a number of issues of concern and where we require a lot of intervention. So we do like see that there is a low access of the poor to expensive foods such as pulses, vegetables, oils, fruits, meat products, all of these which are essential to provide essential proteins, fats, and micronutrients. Like we said, it's not just about cereal and filling your stomach, but you need all these diverse foods. There is still not adequate focus on children under 2 years. This is extremely important because this is the age where malnutrition sets in. This is the age where malnutrition is reversible. So that is something that we don't see happening sufficiently yet. There is the issue of the cycle of malnutrition and infection. So it is not only the question of getting the food to people, but also reducing diarrhea, reducing malaria, and so on, which raises issues related to sanitation, water. There is some improvement in sanitation post the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, but huge gaps exist even there as well. Access to health services is also very important, that immediately if there is an infection, that there is primary care available. Immunization, particularly of for things like measles and so on, is also has an impact on absorption. Breastfeeding is another factor which I've not mentioned here, that all of these also matter when it comes to how the absorption takes place. So the absorption aspect has a lot of issues. I will not go into that very much, but quickly to just say that this is another way in which malnutrition is looked at. This is a very commonly used conceptual framework that therefore you have to look at when you look at nutrition. And before we look at government programs or interventions, what is the framework in which you can look at malnutrition? So moving on from food security's dimensions to the broader issue of malnutrition, that it is of course immediately caused. The immediate determinants are finally to do with your food intake and your health. But the food intake and health is affected by access to food, which we have discussed, water, sanitation, and health services, and also maternal and child care, which we have not discussed in much detail, but one can understand why these are linked, because if it is in utero, if it is immediately after birth, it's amongst young children, then it's not only a question of having the food, it's not only a question of preventing disease, but it is also a question of intra-household distribution. It's a question of care. Children under 2 don't eat on their own. So it is a question of who is feeding them, who has the time. So there is a lot of gender dimensions that come in here, not just in terms of the woman's own health and how healthy she is to be able to have a healthy pregnancy, but also how much time the woman, because the burden falls only on her, is able to give to childcare also is an important determinant of finally what is that food that is going into the child, and therefore what is the nutritional outcomes that we see. The basic underlying determinants for all of these are of course the broad macro things that we look at: institutions, political frameworks, economic structure, and so on. All of these impact, and that's where the issues of availability and all that comes in. That each of these aspects, when we look at it, we have to look at distribution of resources, how they are how they're distributed, agriculture output, minimum support price, what are the factors that are going into costs of production, what crops are remunerated. All of this will come in just by when we look at availability from a nutritional perspective. And then access would lead you to look at the employment structure, livelihoods of people, what are the kind of incomes that they are earning, and then absorption of course would look at these factors to do with maternal and child care, water, sanitation, and health services, and so on. A slightly more detailed way of looking at this, the Lancet, which is one of the most reputed international journals of public health, brought out this framework in 2013, which is now used by governments and international organizations across, which is basically further breaking up is what this middle part is. But quickly, because the last bit, these last 10 minutes I want to spend on looking at government interventions. So the Lancet, to affect these, all of these, to affect these, or in these more detailed part, the Lancet basically divides the programs into nutrition specific and nutrition sensitive. So to address nutrition and food security, you need certain things which are direct, which are things like what in our country would be things like the Anganwadi program, which is directly looking at breastfeeding and complementary feeding, micronutrient supplements, so giving iron tablets, giving iron syrups, treatment for severe acute malnutrition, feeding behavior, so Poshan Abhiyan, this entire campaign on what you should eat, how you should feed, and so on. These are the things that would come under your nutrition specific. But what is also important is what is called nutrition sensitive, which is basically then addresses a lot of the availability and affordability parts of it. So agriculture and food security, social safety nets, early child development, all these things. And for each of these points that have been mentioned in this table, there are rigorous, now even quantitative evidence to show how all of these contribute to better nutritional outcomes. So I'm also moving a little bit from food security to nutrition to say that it's not just about, so it's food security for better nutritional outcomes, and that is the way we have to look at it. So if we look at in this context, what have been the state interventions in India to address the problem of food security and malnutrition, there have been many. Firstly, starting with the Constitution, our Constitution, Article 21 is on the right to life, which has been interpreted to mean a right to life with dignity. And there are a number of Supreme Court judgments and also the International Human Rights Framework, which says that you cannot have a right to life with dignity without having food security for all. And India also has a strong history of a framework of welfare schemes. Of course, there are gaps, there is corruption, there's poor implementation, and all that. But at the same time, we need to recognize that it is also one of the strengths that India has when you compare to a number of other developing countries, which is that there is a framework of welfare schemes and programs for food security and social protection. And this framework has been also strengthened by the Supreme Court. There was a right to food case in the Supreme Court, which was one of the longest running mandamus in the history of this kind of public interest litigation across the world. And in this case, the Supreme Court from 2001 to 17 passed a number of orders which kind of turned these various welfare schemes like the school midday meals, old age pension, all of these into legal entitlements. And it kind of set a framework of what would be the entitlement based interventions that the government should undertake as part of ensuring food security and nutrition. And that framework kind of formed the basis of the National Food Security Act that was passed in 2013. So the National Food Security Act has a number of different entitlements. I will quickly go through each of these and very briefly point out some of the issues and challenges that we have in them. We don't have very much time left, but in the 10 minutes, I think I can at least highlight. And these are things that many of you might be familiar with because there is a public debate and discussion on these that we see continuously going on. The first, in terms of its coverage as well as the cost, is the public distribution system. The PDS is a system through which subsidized food grains are delivered to people, and under the National Food Security Act, the entitlement is that 75% of the rural population and 50% of the urban population are supposed to be covered under the PDS in what is called the priority category. So under this, if you have a priority ration card, then for each individual in the household, 5 kgs of rice or wheat or millets are given at highly subsidized prices. Now, based on this post NFSA, 80 crore individuals in our country are covered under the National Food Security Act. There have been a number of issues under the NFSA, under the PDS, which we don't have time to go into. Primarily has been the issue of identification of the poor. Who are these 75% in rural and 50% in urban who will be included? Although because the coverage increased, the number of exclusion errors did reduce after the NFSA, there are still people who are excluded from the PDS, and that is getting highlighted currently in the context of the COVID again, where there are many more people who are hungry and looking for grain. It is being seen that there are people who are still excluded. One important issue for the exclusion is also the lack of updation of population figures. So the current distribution of the number of ration cards is based on the 2011 census. Whereas if you just update the proportion, 75% rural and 50% urban to the 2020 projected population, then at least another 10 crore people have to be included under the PDS. The other contradictory issue in the PDS is just 2 more points about the PDS. One, that despite the leakages and whatever problems, post-COVID, in the last 1 year, all the fields of surveys that have been taken place, be it by the Azim Premji University, by Dalberg Consultants, by Right to Food Campaign, by a team in IIT, a team in ICRIER, all these various surveys are showing that of the various relief measures that are available, PDS has been the one which has reached out to people most and which has helped them prevent starvation. So despite its gaps and so on, at this time of crisis, the PDS has been a system that has been able to reach out to people most. That was the first, and therefore its importance. The second point related to PDS that I want to make is that so there is a case for continuing the PDS and actually expanding it. The other thing that adds to this case is the fact that we have the highest number of food stocks in the FCI godowns currently, which is 80 million tons. which is way above the buffer stock norms are about 20 million tons. So this is much higher than how much we should be holding. So we have the grain, we know it's an effective program, and therefore it is something that needs to be extended. The other three schemes are particularly directed at the vulnerable groups, women and children. And there is a lot of, again, research and evidence to show that each of these, particularly the midday meal, but also the Anganwadi, are very effective in a number of ways, not just in reducing malnutrition, but increasing attendance, ensuring enrollment, retention, learning outcomes. In all of these, this make a big difference. Again, these are things which have been they have expanded. There was a Supreme Court order in 2002 to universalize cooked meals, after which now this is, again, any of you who have done field work or who have an exposure to rural areas and what's happening, you would know that midday meal is one of those schemes that works. Again, there are problems. The dal is too watery, or the quality is bad, or there are stones in the rice and so on. But pre-COVID, if you went to any random rural school during the food time, you would see that there is a meal prepared and the children are eating, which says a lot given the kind of difficulties we have in implementation. The ICDS Anganwadi, another very important scheme, because it addresses at that crucial under 6 children. Again, it has a lot of quality issues. It's only about 6 rupees a day that is spent on food for the child, where ideally they should be getting an egg or getting milk and fruits and so on, which would require more money. Maternity entitlements, finally, again, extremely important because of the gender dimensions. For breastfeeding to happen, with more than 95% women in the informal sector, maternity leave is not a reality for most women in India, and therefore cash-based maternity entitlements play a significant role in not just women getting rest and nutrition for themselves, but being able to exclusively breastfeed their children for the period of 6 months. On all of these, the impact of COVID is a bit worrying, because midday meals, ICDS, maternity entitlements, these have almost came to a halt last year. They began to be, again, start functioning, where we now have the second wave. And in this context, where our malnutrition outcomes are already kind of stagnant or reducing, it is a concern if these things don't function for a long time, what the impact would be. So just to conclude, what we have seen is these various dimensions of food security in terms of availability, access, and utilization. And we see that in each of those that there are issues of concern, but at the same time, it is an area where we know what should be done, because there is a lot of global as well as national research, but it is also an area requiring much more investments from the state. And these are investments which have to be seen as investments and not subsidies, because they have huge long-term returns in terms of adult productivity, health, and so on. And therefore, these need to be seen as economic returns and require higher investments. I will stop here. I think I've